It was either in October or November. I ought to remember if the leaves had fallen. There's something reassuring about specifying a precise time, for how can I rely on that part of my memory dictating the events itself, when I've forgotten important details of the setting, one thing being so dependent on other things after all. And time is part of the setting. Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Kjell Askildsen's short story collection, Everything Like Before, translated from the Norwegian by Seán Kinsella and published by Archipelago Books. Askildsen is a really renowned author in Norway who's been publishing for almost 70 years. Most of his work has been short stories, for which he's won numerous literary awards, perhaps most prestigiously the Nordic Critics Prize for literature. This collection is made up of 36 short stories based on two different short story collections in Norwegian, I believe. The short stories here are of varying lengths. Some are only a page long, some are like 20 pages. Most are just a few pages though, just a handful of pages. Usually small vignettes that are so powerful because of their conscious brevity. Askildsen writes in a really unadorned, sparse prose style. It's deceptively simple, especially the dialogue. It seems that they're often talking about very simple, very mundane things. But what Askildsen does so well, I think, is make what's left unsaid so important, so that while the prose may seem simple, there's so much depth to it. That is, conversations are almost always about something completely different from what they're actually talking about. To illustrate what I mean, in the second story, A Lovely Spot, we have a married couple who's staying in a family cabin in the woods on vacation. The couple is congenial enough, but right from the start of the story, you can see that there's a bit of tension between them. The tension is pretty subtle though, and I think that actually makes it much more palpable. For instance, they arrive at the house, and the man just wants to relax. And the woman is insistent that he go out and raise the flag on the flagpole right away, as it seems to be some sort of tradition that her family would do as soon as they got to the cabin. He reluctantly goes and does it. In the next scene, we just get this very simple conversation. They were by the kitchen table. They had eaten. She sat looking out the window in the direction of the dense forest. "Isn't this a lovely spot?" she said. "Certainly is," he said. "I don't think there's anyone who has a nicer place," she said. He did not reply. "I just wish we could cut back all that scrub at the edge of the forest." "Why?" he said. "It's just so you can't see what's behind it." "It's not on our property," he said. "No," she said, "but still. Dad used to always cut it back." They sat in silence for a while. Throughout this story, the refrain, "This is a lovely spot," seems to work as a cover for all the internal and marital problems that both characters have but can't really voice. We see this throughout all of these stories as relationships fall apart because the characters either can't vocalize their feelings or they're always being misunderstood. If there's one thing I learned from reading this collection, is that Askildsen is as much interested in what's left unsaid as he is with what is said. It's almost as though it's through the absence of the spoken words of our characters and the constant misunderstandings of each other and of themselves that our understanding of them really comes. Alongside this idea, a really prominent theme in these stories is the idea of doubling. Characters often come in pairs, in marriages, in siblings. There's even a couple of stories about a set of twins, or in kind of seemingly random meetings between two strangers. This works in conjunction with one of the primary themes of the collection, as hinted at by the title, Everything Like Before, that of a person's memory and their relationship to their own past, and thus their own previous experiences and traumas. We see this theme of doubling used in a lot of the stories, but I'll just focus here on one of my favorite stories, A Sudden Liberating Thought. This story is about an old man who goes to the park every day and sits down on the same bench. One day, another old man comes and sits down next to him. Nervous that he's going to try to talk to him, the first old man looks at him, and the newcomer just responds, "Forgive me for saying, but I sat here because I thought I'd be left in peace. I can move, of course, if you'd like." They agree to sit in peace, and eventually they get up and leave. But this happens again the next day, and the next day after that, and eventually the two old men start talking a bit more. And the first old man becomes obsessed with these conversations. It's all he can think about, and all he thinks about is how to best start these conversations. The problem is that this new guy, this new older man, keeps starting the conversation with how the first old man planned to start the conversation. At one point, this happens, and the text reads, "Again, I was struck by how he sat there delivering my line, and for a moment I was foolish enough to think that I was imagining everything, that he didn't even exist, that in reality I was sitting talking to myself. And I suppose it was this foolishness that prompted me to pose a completely ill-considered question. Who are you, really?" The conversations that they have themselves are actually really interesting as they start talking about euthanasia, and we learn that one of the characters used to be a doctor and he performed these euthanasias, though he doesn't really seem to remember or care to remember. But what I find really interesting about this conversation and conversations like this throughout this book is the idea of having a doppelganger. It's very similar to a lot of the stuff we see in Samuel Beckett's novels and his plays, of course. But it's also a fundamental theme in another contemporary Norwegian author, Jan Fosse, who explores this motif a lot, most prominently in his series that is still ongoing, The Other Name Septology, where most of the characters are kind of parts of the same character but from different parts of his life, and stuff like that. And Fosse really plays with this idea of all the characters kind of being the exact same character in different ways. Here in Askildsen's stories, it's not quite as clear. I think what Askildsen is doing in these stories is exploring how the relationships between people itself is the thing that really exists, and the individual is only real by proxy, or something like that. That is, whereas Beckett and Fosse seem more interested on the psychological internal workings of this motif, Askildsen seems more interested in the interpersonal. The last story I just spoke about looks at these conversations between these two old men, and old men are often the primary characters in these stories. There's a few stories from the perspective of young married couples or middle-aged men, but most of the stories are told by kind of grumpy older men who are looking back on their lives, often after the loss of a loved one or some sort of tragedy. These characters all explore their pasts, often through wry humor and sardonic wit. They're often simply just waiting for death. The story Chess opens with this brilliant line that I just love. "The world isn't like it used to be. For one thing, it takes longer to live. I'm in my late 80s, and that still is not enough." There's a humor to these stories. It's often pretty subtle, and more often it's quite dark. In another story, one character bumps into an old friend, and to his annoyance has to stand and now catch up with this old friend. And at one point during this conversation, annoyed, he says to him, "I become more and more lonely with every person I meet." It's not a very kind thing to say, but I thought it was actually pretty funny. And this gets to the last sort of theme that I want to talk about, which is how all these stories explore a sort of existentialist philosophy in various ways. Again, most of these stories are told from the perspective of these old men who are honestly on the precipice of death, and they confront their past, their relations, and ultimately they confront God. In one of my favorite stories called Mardon's Night, about a father and a son, both named Mardon, again, you see that doubling there, one of the characters says, "We can't actually do anything about who we are, can we? We're completely at the mercy of our pasts, aren't we? And we didn't have a hand in creating our pasts. We're arrows flying from the womb and landing in a graveyard. And what does it matter how high we flew at the moment we land, or how far we flew, or how many we hurt on our way?" This sort of frustrated determinism, this lack of control, plagues a lot of these characters as their traumas and past experiences mold them, and they can't escape that molding. One character named Gabriel in this story, Encounter, talks to his aging father, who was pretty abusive to Gabriel and his mother in his childhood. Gabriel doesn't want to talk to his father, but he feels guilty if he doesn't, as his father is aging and getting old. Most of the story takes place in the father's house, which had, quote, "walls covered in God and shelves filled with him." There are books on God everywhere, as well as these sort of tacky signs hung up on the wall everywhere that say things like, God is love. Gabriel confronts his father aggressively, admitting how scared he was of his father as a kid, connecting his relationship to his father with that of Isaac's relationship to Abraham in Genesis. His father sort of refuses to repent, and the argument escalates to an argument about God, as Gabriel can't reconcile his father's belief in God with the abuses that he put out onto Gabriel and Gabriel's mother. And he tells Gabriel to not blame God for his own cynicism, and Gabriel responds, "Not God, the idea of God, that tenacious myth of a power justifying actions and viewpoints that the future will call inhuman. You believe that God is the purpose of your faith, but that's not true. God is nothing but the belief in God, and that's why God will die. He's dying day by day. You're deranged. No, I merely represent a future that will renounce a legacy, that will refuse to shoulder the burden of God. You should leave now. Yes." As always with Askildsen, the characters are always talking about multiple things at once. Every conversation has multiple layers. Gabriel only seems to have a problem with God because of his problem with his father. We see another character wrestling with the existence of God, again in the story Midsummer, which is about two teenage boys. In this story, two teenage boys debate the existence of God before hiking up a steep rock face. The boy, Carl, who doesn't believe in God, approaches the edge of the cliff face, and he asks if it's true that God cannot be mocked. The other boy, our narrator, says yes, God can't be mocked. And I'll just read from the text. "He looked at me. He was scared. He was standing with his back to the sea and the rooftops. He took a small step backward. I stood as though nailed to the spot. I felt dizzy. It always happens. I can't bear to look at people balancing on the brink of a precipice. But unbearable as it is, I'm fascinated by it, and I didn't turn away. He took another step backwards and stood just a few centimeters from the edge, still with his back to it. I knew heights made him just as lightheaded as me. We stared at each other. I think I meant a lot to him in that moment. He was so afraid and so brave. I mock God, he said, or whispered rather. The words hardly reached me. His lips continued to move, but I couldn't hear any more. Then he turned and looked down, giving God the best card he held, his dizziness. I don't know how long he stood there. Long enough, longer than I would have managed to stand there to prove the opposite, that God existed, and I dared to put my life in his hands. Overall, as with almost every short story collection I read, I do think that some of the stories could have been cut. Towards the end of this collection, we get a series of stories named directly after characters, and these are, for the most part, really super short vignettes, just a couple of pages. And that, to me, they sometimes are too much of flash fiction. That is, a lot of the really short stories are quite interesting, but there's more than a couple that I find to feel like they're just not really finished. I do prefer the longer short stories here, but that might just be personal preference. I'm really not super into short stories. Some of the longer stories are very Kafkaesque, and I really wanted some more of those. But if you like short stories, Askildsen is a clear master of the genre, and I think that this is a solid collection to read. The seeming simplicity of his stories are contradicted by the complexity of the ideas he explores throughout the collection. There's so much disconnect between characters that you're really left to think about what it is that actually connects them. In many cases, it seems like it is the disconnect which connects them. Clearly, there's a level of absurdism in some of these stories, but there's also a level of realism in which we see characters struggling to maintain connections with loved ones. There's something so human about that struggle, especially as we grow older and grow further and further apart from each other. A bit of a somber note to end on, but don't let that get in the way of enjoying these stories. Again, a lot of them are really funny, but here are just some more general thoughts after reading this collection. I may try to do like a close reading or something like that of a specific story, because I think a basic close reading would actually work really well with Askildsen's prose style. But for now, let me know if you read any Askildsen, or if you've read this connection, and if you have, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.